this first talk in the series is called The Hope of Israel, and we're going to focus upon the unmistakable sign of the fig tree. And we're going to see just how important this is. The things that God has done in relation to Israel and what he proposes to do with Israel are critically important to everyone who has burning in their heart the hope of Israel. And of course we know that our God never leaves his attention from this land. We read, of course, in places like Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 12, the land which Yahweh thy God careth for. The eyes of Yahweh thy God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year even unto the end of the year. Sadly, of course, young people, what our God sees going on in the land of Israel today doesn't please him very much at all. And we'll be talking about that as we proceed in our considerations. But for you and me, we can share that with our God. We can look at this land. This is our land, young people. This is the place where we are going. If we are in the kingdom of God, we're going to have an inheritance in this land. And in our hearts ought to be burning the hope of Israel. And when we look at what God has done with Israel, we can see just how important it is. He never sleeps. He that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. And of course, those who touch his people do so with the danger of him intervening on their behalf. For he that toucheth you, he said, touches the apple of his eye. So we're going to be talking tonight about the place of the hope of Israel, both in relation to ourselves and of course in relation to God's people. Now when you go to our Christadelphian writings, you find statements made like this is from the story of the Bible about the fig tree. The fig tree is a well-known Bible symbol representing Israel. Of course the passages are given. And Jesus used it on several occasions in that way. On one occasion he cursed a barren fig tree to teach the lesson that Israel must produce fruit if it wanted to escape a similar fate. On another occasion, he told his disciples the parable of the budding fig tree, that is, restored Israel, to show that this would constitute a notable sign that the establishment of God's kingdom on earth was at hand. That, of course, is from the writings of our brother H.B. Mansfield. Sister Alice Hopkins, in her book Lessons from Nature, wrote this: the barren fig tree was a type of Israel. It was cursed by Christ, we know. But Christ also used the fig tree and all the trees as a sign of his coming kingdom. So we're going to go back. Now, for most young people, of course, 1948 it sounds like ancient history, doesn't it? Well, it's the year before I was born, so it gives a bit of an idea how old I am. But 1948 seems to young people like ancient history. But it's not all that long ago. It's only 70 or nearly 70 years ago. It's not all that long ago, really. So in the divine scheme of things, it's recent history. And we're going to have a look at that history. Now, we are, of course, in this year, 2017, and the world is acknowledging this, we are 100 years beyond a very significant year in the divine scheme of unfolding Bible prophecy. That year was 1917. In 1917, we're going to see there was very significant events occurred. And as a result of the events of the First World War and of the Turkish power being pushed out of Palestine, as it was then called, the nation of Britain was given a mandate over the land of Palestine because Britain had issued what was called the Balfour Declaration. And more about that in a moment. And the Balfour Declaration, of course, was Britain's attempt to help the Jews in repayment for the work of Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who had invented synthetic cordite and saved the British from humiliating defeat at the hand of the Germans in the First World War. That was their reward to the Jews. So here we have, of course, culminating out of that, ultimately in 1948, we had the nation of Israel established. The fig tree was back in the earth again. Still not bearing fruit, by the way. The one that Christ cursed, you remember, didn't have any fruit on it. All there was fig leaves. Well, the nation's still not bearing fruit to Almighty God. But the fig tree is there to testify that his purpose is unfolding in the earth. And of course the day came in 1948 on the 14th of May when the nation of Israel was declared. That was the day that the British actually physically left the land of Palestine. And of course the British power, Brother Thomas points out in Opus Israel, based on Isaiah 18 verse 1, was the land shadowing with wings. And God used the British to bring about circumstances that would ultimate in the establishment of the state of Israel. Brother Thomas wrote this in Opus Israel, page 455. He said, "I know not whether the men who at present contrive the foreign policy of Britain," and this was in 1848, "entertain the idea of assuming the sovereignty of the Holy Land and of promoting its colonisation by the Jews. Their present intentions, however, are of no importance, one way or the other, because they will be compelled by events soon to happen to do what, under existing circumstances, heaven and earth combined could not move them to attempt." And of course he's making the point that it doesn't matter what the politicians of the world think. If God wants to use them in his purpose, he will use them. And he will bring circumstances to bear upon them that they can't avoid. They will be pushed in a certain direction that is unavoidable. And that's what happened to the power of Britain. They were used by God to bring about this event, the declaration of the State of Israel on the 14th of May, 1948. Now, there's some folk in this room probably who were around then. Certainly my parents rejoiced along with many other brethren and sisters when that nation was declared. They saw that as a fulfilment of Bible prophecy, as significant in their day as 1967 was to me when I was your age, okay, as a late teenager. As significant as the events of 2016 were, young people, when Britain voted to leave the European Union. That is an unbelievable event in the unfolding of God's purpose. But it happened because of God's manipulation of the circumstances that brought that about. So this was a huge event in that time. And of course it was preceded by a vote in the United Nations on the 29th of November 1947, when the partition motion was put. And of course it was won by 33 votes to 13, and we'll come to that in a second. Now, just a word about the involvement of America in that, and also Russia. The President of the United States at the time was Harry Truman. He was one of Israel's staunchest friends. I want to give you the reasons why he was one of Israel's staunchest friends. Harry Truman, of course, like any other politician, he was a Democrat. Democrats are normally the party that the Jews support, but this man had a particular relationship with the Jews, as we will see. Now, God used this man. You might remember that the President of the United States during the Second World War was Franklin D. Roosevelt. They call him FDR. Well, he died on the 12th of April 1945, just before, of course, the Germans capitulated in Europe on the 7th of May that year. And that brought Harry Truman to power. And Harry Truman was the man who made the decision to use the atomic bomb on the Japanese to save American lives. Probably saved about 150,000 Americans from dying in conquering Japan. That brought about the end of the Second World War, and then events unfolded that led to the establishment of the State of Israel. So here's Truman conferring with Abba Eban, who was the Israeli, at least at that time, the Jews' foreign minister or representative of the United Nations. And there is, of course, David Ben-Gurion, who was their first Prime Minister, the man who made the declaration on the 14th of May of the statehood of Israel. And there's another man who was involved here. If you have a look down here at this picture, this is Andrei Gromyko. Now, he was, of course, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations at that time. And Russia also supported the establishment of the State of Israel. And I want to show you a principle there that you're all familiar with. We see it at work here, because you see here we've got this man who was the representative of Russia, and they were behind the establishment of the State of Israel. This is one of the signed voting sheets that was used. And if you have a look carefully, you can actually see, you might need binoculars at the back there, but you can actually see the signature of Harry Truman, the President of the United States of America. And there are many other very important people who have signed this particular document. And of course it points out that there were 33 votes for, 13 nations against There were 10 abstentions, and sadly, one of those abstentions, doesn't mean you don't vote, was Britain. They abstained from supporting the establishment of the State of Israel. Of course, they were struck with problems after that. But guess what happened to the United States of America and Russia post-establishment of the State of Israel? Both of those nations prospered. Both became superpowers. And then, of course, we had the Cold War. That happened because, you see, there's a principle at work here, young people. There's a principle that God spelled out to Abraham, the very first promise that he made to him. Blessed be those who bless you, and cursed be those who curse you. Okay, and that was seen. Now, there's a much deeper meaning to that promise that God made to Abraham, much deeper meaning than that. But on the surface, that has shown itself to be true. Right down through history, those who curse Israel are cursed. Those who bless Israel are blessed. Let me show you what happened in the case of Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman, after the First World War, went into business with a Jew. That Jew was Eddie Jacobson. They bought together in the 1920s a haberdashery shop. Now, we don't have haberdashery shops anymore. We have clothing stores, okay? So they started off a clothing store, a haberdashery shop, and it went defunct. The 1920s was not a great time, and of course at the end of the 1920s we had the beginning of the Great Depression. So the thing went defunct. But they were very good friends. They were business partners and very good friends. And Harry Truman, of course, gave access to this gentleman, Eddie Jacobson. As it says here, this cemented an already strong relationship that gave Jacobson open access to the Oval Office when Truman became president on the 12th of April 1945, when Franklin D. Roosevelt died. It was to be an important friendship in relation to Israel. And this is what Wikipedia says about that relationship. On March the 13th, 1948, now this is just before the declaration of the State of Israel on the 14th of May, Jacobson went to the White House and at that meeting persuaded Truman to meet with the leader of the Zionist movement, Dr. Chaim Weizmann. Now, Chaim Weizmann was the man who had invented synthetic cordite during the First World War. He was the man that brought about the British giving the Balfour Declaration. See, and so he was the most important Jew alive at that time. And he wanted access to Harry Truman. Truman had been increasingly irritated by lobbying from Zionists. They were pretty pushy people. And had issued instructions that he did not want to see any more Zionist spokesmen. But Jacobson reminded him about his admiration for Andrew Jackson and said, "Your hero is Andrew Jackson. I have a hero too. He's the greatest Jew alive. I'm talking about Chaim Weizmann. He's an old man and very sick, and he has travelled thousands of miles to see you. And now you're putting him off. This isn't like you, Harry." This is how friends can talk to each other, isn't it? So here is Jacobson talking to the President of America saying, "Come on, let this guy in, talk to him." And of course he did. And the result of that was, of course, America's support for the establishment of the State of Israel. America was the first government, by the way, to actually acknowledge, to recognise the government of Israel within 11 minutes of the declaration being made. 11 minutes, that's how long it took them to say we support the establishment of the State of Israel. So partly as a result of Jacobson's efforts, the United States became the first nation to grant diplomatic recognition to the new State of Israel on the 14th of May 1948. You reckon God was at work there, young people? That these two people came together, and that Truman goes into a business partnership with a Jew, that Jew becomes a very close friend. They end up, by the way, both having to bear enormous debts as a result of the failure of their business. So they were both in the same hole together. And that brought them together, and God used that. That's the way he works to bring about his purpose. So what did this mean for Truman? Well, a little bit like last year. You remember the election in America last year when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were vying for the presidency of America? Remember that? Well, everybody thought that Clinton would win easily. Remember that? I mean, even the Newsweek came out the next morning saying that Clinton had won because, of course, the result hadn't been declared when they went to press. And they came out just like this idiotic paper. This is the Chicago Tribune. This is way back in 1948, November 1948. Because, of course, the result wasn't declared until very late in the night, they went to the press. And because the polls, like last year, were saying that Thomas Dewey was going to win and defeat Truman, and that's the way the polls were, they thought, well, we'll print it. Well, they were mugs, weren't they? They were idiots. Because the next morning, here's Truman waving this newspaper saying, you got it wrong, fellas. Just like Trump said, you got it wrong. See, there's a point here, isn't there? The point is this: it can look bad, really bad for you, but if you have done what Truman did for Israel, then God is going to bless you. So here we've got that principle. You bless Israel, you'll be blessed. You curse Israel, you'll be cursed. That's the way that God works, and that's been seen in history over and over again. There's just one case of it. So, where are we? Well, we're in 2017. Why is that important? I mentioned the Balfour Declaration. It was issued on the 2nd of November 1917. A short while later, General Allenby, leading, of course, the Empire's forces, including Australian soldiers and especially Australian horsemen who captured Beersheba, he entered Jerusalem on the 11th of December 1917. He got off his white horse and he walked into the city, not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. And he came to that place acknowledging its importance in the scheme of things. Just like Alexander the Great had got off his horse and walked with the priests into Jerusalem way back in 333 BC. It was seen again. Do you know that the current Prime Minister of Britain, Theresa May, has said that the Balfour Declaration, which is just a very short letter, and I'll show it to you later on during the course of this series, that little declaration made by the British in 1917, she says, is one of the most important letters in history, and she proposes to celebrate that this year. That's how important she sees that little letter that was written on the 2nd of November. So we should see the importance of this, should we not? Because we are in a very significant year. We are 100 years on from the Balfour Declaration. We are exactly 50 years on from the capture by the Jews of the old city of Jerusalem on the 7th of June 1967. By the way, that was the year I was baptised. So that's how long ago that was. 50 years ago. We saw that amazing event of the Jews taking the city of Jerusalem. And of course Luke 21:24 was fulfilled in that day. And I'm going to make another comment about that a little later on. So what might 2017 bring? Well, it's pretty obvious that God works in 50-year periods, isn't it? So 1917, 50 years later, 1967. 1967, 50 years later, is 2017. So does God work in 50-year periods? Well, he certainly does. Let's go right back here to 1847. Now that probably means not too much to many of you. But 1847 was the most important year for Latter-day Christadelphians. Do you know that? The most important year for Latter-day Christadelphians. Do you know why? That was the year that John Thomas finally discovered the truth, the full truth, and was baptised, if you can count his infant baptism. He was baptised for the 3rd time. He wasn't baptised again because he had the truth. You know what brought him to a full understanding of the truth? I'll point this out to you in a minute. The hope of Israel. You know, the next year he did a lengthy tour of Britain, lecturing, out of which came a book called Elpis Israel, the hope of Israel. Okay? 1847 was the most important year for Latter-day Christadelphians. If that hadn't happened, if under the hand of God that man had not discovered the truth, young people, you wouldn't be sitting here as Christadelphians, and I wouldn't be speaking from this platform as a Christadelphian. Never forget that. Most important year of the modern era, when the truth was finally uncovered from the rubble of orthodox Christianity, of all the nonsense that blinds people. God worked through that man. It took him 15 years of hard, slogging hardship, fighting and arguing, debating and studying like no man's ever studied until he finally got it. And that is what means so much to you and me, because that's what led to me, being a Christadelphian, having burning in my heart as you've got burning in yours, the hope of Israel. Not too many people in our world have got that. Okay? So we need to appreciate that heritage. So 1847 is very important. 50 years further on, from 1847 was 1897. What happened in 1897? That was the year in which the first Zionist Congress was called in Basel, Switzerland. You know what happened at that Congress? They decided that they were going to push to have a state. They're going to get their old land back. All right? They wanted the land of Palestine back, did the Jews. And of course, the man who had brought that about was Theodor Herzl. And he had written a book called The Judenstaat, or the Jewish State, in 1896. He called this Congress, and he said, people will laugh at that, but in 5 years they might see that we've made some progress. Certainly, he said, in 50 years they will know. Well, exactly 50 years later, what happened? 50 years after 1897 was 1947. And on the 29th of November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the land of Palestine into two sections, one to be given to the Jews, the other to be given to the Palestinians or the Arabs. And the State of Israel was born the next year. God works in 50-year periods. What I'm suggesting to you is something highly significant in relation to the future of Israel has to happen in 2017. Has it happened yet, do you think? Don't think so. The world will be acknowledging like they did 67. Hasn't happened yet. What do you think it might be, young people? Well, I'm hoping that it might be the greatest event in human history. The appearance, not to Israel, but to the Israel of God, the believing community of the latter days, that he might appear to them as their judge and redeemer. Let's hope that 2017 is that significant. In his confession and abjuration, way back in 1847, this comes from a book called The Christadelphians in North America by Charles H. Lippy, published in 1989. He wrote this. So this is an outsider's observation of what happened in the life of John Thomas. On reflection, Thomas concluded that his Campbellite baptism as well as his original baptism had both been invalid, because at neither time had he possessed sufficient knowledge of Jesus and the hope of the coming kingdom of God that he now saw as requisite to genuine belief. Thus, on his return to Virginia in 1847, he was rebaptised again by an unidentified male follower and issued a statement of confession, abjuration and declaration. While issuance of this document has not been treated as a milestone among later Christadelphians, sadly by the way, the statement is nevertheless something of a manifesto, a summary of what Thomas saw as the major tenets of authentic Christianity, of the truth he had been seeking. As such, it also is a capsule of themes around which later Christadelphian thought developed. And of course, just a couple of things out of that declaration will tell us what he was thinking at the time. So this comes out of that. You can actually find this in the book written by Brother Roberts on the life of John Thomas. It was the hope of Israel that was the key that he discovered. And he discovered that because of his understanding of Romans chapter 8 and verse 24. This was the fourth clause of his declaration. Because the editor, and he was an editor of a magazine at the time, was a stranger to the Abrahamic disposition and mode of thinking which are the true type of repentance unto life. 6. Because that men are saved by the hope. Now if you read the King James, for Romans 8 verse 24, it says we are saved by hope. They don't put the article in. But if you go to the original text, which is what he was reading, it says we are saved by the hope. And of course he thought, what hope? What are we talking about here? And then another verse springs to his mind. Acts chapter 28 verse 20, where Paul says, for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain. So he knew, I have missed something here. I have missed the importance of the Abrahamic promises. Most churches have missed the importance of the Abrahamic promises. You can go to most church people and say, what do you know about Abraham? They think he's a racehorse, don't they? They got no idea about Abraham. And so Abraham is critical to Christadelphians, and the hope that was burning in his heart is burning in ours. It now began to burn in the heart of John Thomas, and he's baptised for the third time. So after the lecturing tour of Britain in 1848, he wrote Elpis Israel, which was published in 1849. The hope of Israel was fully expounded therein. It's a great pity that our community is not reading Elpis Israel like it was once read. Robert Roberts read it at age 13. My brother-in-law read it at age 14. Okay? Took me a little longer than that, but it's not all that hard if you apply your mind. Well, then let's turn to latter-day Israel. Let's now, having reviewed how that nation-state came into being in 1948, let's just see what prophecy has to say about them in the latter days. The prophecy of Jeremiah 30 is very important. We might just have a quick look at that. Most of you probably still got Jeremiah 17 open, and you probably saw the reason why we read that, because it talks about Yahweh being the hope of Israel. And we'll come back to that chapter a little later. But just push on to Jeremiah chapter 30. Now, Jeremiah 30 is Jeremiah's dream. It comes on the back of all of the false dreams that he's been talking about from chapter 25 onwards. All of these false dreamers in Judah. And Yahweh, he gets exasperated. And of course the last one of them was this man that you read of in Jeremiah 29 and verse 24, called Shemaiah the Nehelamite. And if your margin says the same as mine, it will tell you that this man, Shemaiah, whose name by the way means Yah has heard, which he hadn't. Shemaiah means Yahweh has heard, but the Nehelamite means he of the dream, or the dreamer. He was the top false dreamer in Judah. He was speaking nonsense from the platform, if I might put it that way. He was in Babylon, by the way. He was writing terrible letters saying that Jeremiah should be put on trial and killed for the prophecies he was making. Okay, so there was all of these false dreams going on. So what does God do to Jeremiah? He gives him a dream. And from verse 4 of Jeremiah 30, and this is well worth marking in your Bible, to verse 26 of Jeremiah 31 is Jeremiah's dream. So have a look at verse 26 of Jeremiah 31. It says this. Verse 26 of Jeremiah 31. It says, "Upon this I awaked and beheld, and my sleep was sweet unto me." Now, all of us know what dreams are like. You can have nightmares, but we're not talking about nightmares here. We're talking about dreams. And you wake up and you think, good grief, where was I? I mean, you can't remember the detail half the time, but it was another world, wasn't it? This is what happened to Jeremiah. He went to sleep, and God gave him a dream, like he gave to Jacob. Remember in Genesis 28? By the way, this dream of Jeremiah is based on Jacob's dream of Genesis 28. But in this dream, we have the latter day prophecy concerning the nation of Israel. This is the time of their redemption. But it comes at the time, if you have a look at verse 7 of Jeremiah 30, verse 7 tells you it comes at the time of Jacob's trouble. It comes at a time which we of course know as Armageddon. And Armageddon is referred to in the last verses of Jeremiah 30, if you just want to have a quick glance at that, verses 23 and 24. You'll see that it's about Armageddon. The whirlwind of Yahweh goes forth. Got that? Okay. So, what's happening then in this era? Well, this is what's happening. Verses 13 and 14 of Jeremiah 30, the verses you can see on the screen. "There is none, says God, to plead thy cause, that thou mayest be bound up. Thou hast no healing medicines. All thy lovers have forgotten thee. They seek thee not. For I have wounded thee with the wound of an enemy, with the chastisement of a cruel one, for the multitude of thine iniquity, because thy sins were increased." Now that hasn't quite happened in its fullness, young people. We saw, of course, under Obama, the last president of the United States, that relationships between America and Israel collapsed. But of course, another man's come along, hasn't he? Who's seemingly a strong supporter of Israel, Donald Trump. Nobody ever thought he'd become president of the United States. But God did, and God made sure he was put there because God's going to use him as an instrument. And it's amazing the way he's already using him, as I'm going to demonstrate here tonight. Did you know that up until 1990, 175 UN, that's United Nations Security Council, and 690 General Assembly resolutions passed before 1990, 97 of the 175, and 429 of the 690 were directed against Israel. I wonder what else they were doing in the United Nations. Well, most of what they were doing was directed against Israel, and nothing has changed ever since. Nothing has changed. Israel has been bereft of supporters. They are hated as a nation. And last year, of course, Netanyahu had had enough of that. He was given a 45-minute speech in the United Nations, and he stopped speaking for 45 seconds. I reckon if I stopped for 45 seconds, the pianist would be up here to play the last hymn. Wouldn't you? Okay? You think, well, what on earth's happening? Well, he stopped for 45 seconds. He didn't say a word. He just stood there and looked out at the audience. And then he said, that's the kind of help we get from you people when we're attacked by our enemies. You all sit there like dummies and do nothing. They were greatly embarrassed by that. But it's true. This prophecy has been partially fulfilled. It hasn't been fully fulfilled yet. So, of course, Israel has had to have the support of the United States using its veto power in the Security Council. Otherwise, it would have been tossed out of the United Nations a long time ago. As I said, under Obama, the US distinctly shifted its support away from Israel. And you know what? They thought that Hillary Clinton would win the presidential election. I had my doubts from the outset. You know why I had my doubts? Look at her history. From her very earliest days, she has been anti-Semitic. In her early days, when she was a pinky, a left-wing socialist, all right, and she still is basically, but she was openly socialist in her policies. She hated Israel. She absolutely hated Israel. And the only reason that she gave any support vocally to the Jews was she needed their vote. She needed them to vote for her to become a senator and ultimately become president. And God knew that. She didn't become president. Another demonstration of that principle. You curse Israel, watch out. Well, here's the man who's now president of the United States of America. And he has a daughter, Ivanka, from his first wife, Ivana. And she happens to be married to a Jew who is a very strict Orthodox Jew. He doesn't wear the curls, of course, but he's very strict in his religion. And during the election campaign, Trump boasted he would be a much stronger supporter of Israel than Obama or that Hillary Clinton would have been. During the campaign, he made it very clear his policies towards Israel. He spoke of his unbreakable friendship with the state of Israel. He would give much stronger support for Israel in the United Nations, that is in the veto, overthrowing votes against Israel. His number one priority would be to dismantle Obama's disastrous nuclear deal with Iran. He's having trouble doing that. He will not allow Israel to be treated like a second-class citizen by the Arab states, he said. And the US embassy in Israel will be moved, he said, to Jerusalem. He's having a few problems with that. But I want to just show you why God has put this man. There are probably many reasons why God has put Trump into the presidency of America. But I want to show you things that have become clear since his election. And they have become clear. So there are some emerging reasons for the election of Donald Trump against all the odds. As I said, he has a son-in-law who plays a very important part, but he has another man. One of the first appointments that he made when he became president was his ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, who of course is an American Jew, a strong supporter of Israel and an advocate, listen to this, an advocate for the annexation by Israel of the West Bank. That has to happen before Armageddon, as I'll show you in a minute. Trump's favourite daughter, Ivanka, as I said, is married to Jared Kushner, a strict Jew, who is now Donald Trump's principal advisor, as young as he might be. Kushner is also a very close friend of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, a man called Mohammed bin Salman. This is all going on, by the way, young people around us. The hand of God is at work in the earth. He's using this man, Trump, for his purpose. So let's just take his appointment as the ambassador to Israel first. This was from the New York Times in December last year. Trump named David M. Friedman, aligned with the Israeli far right, as his nominee for ambassador to Israel. He has outspoken views that stand in stark contrast to decades of American policy toward Israel. Those views include that it would not be illegal for Israel to annex the West Bank. So why is that important? Well, it's important because, of course, of Bible prophecy. Ezekiel 38 verse 8. So just move on to Ezekiel 38 with me. Ezekiel 38 verse 8. This is what it says. Now this is God speaking to Gog, the northern invader, as you're all aware. So what do we read here in Ezekiel 38 verse 8? After many days thou shalt be visited, Gog. In the latter years, and we're living in them, thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword. No doubt about what land that is it? And is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel. So where are the mountains of Israel? If Gog's going to come down upon the mountains of Israel, where are the mountains of Israel? Well, the mountains of Israel run from Hebron, which is 1,000 metres, or if you happen to be of my vintage, 3,300 feet above sea level. They run from Hebron down here, right up to Mount Gilboa. Okay? That's the mountains of Israel. There's a massive, a central massive, a mountain range that runs through the centre of the land like a spine of a human body. Okay? 90% of the mountains of Israel happen to be in today's West Bank. In that red line you can see there. Okay? So what that means, brethren and sisters and young people, is that must become part of Israel proper before Armageddon. When Netanyahu won the election a couple of years ago, one of the first things he said was, Israel will eventually annex the West Bank. When I took a party to Israel in 2010, we stopped at Shiloh. Now Shiloh's in the West Bank, just a bit north of Ramallah. We stopped there because we wanted to see the fulfilment of Bible prophecy. Bible prophecy said that Shiloh would become a total desolation. So we stopped and looked up, and there's the hill of Shiloh. And all it was limestone rocks, barren. I took another party there in 2015, and we stopped at Shiloh. And we look up and, good grief, there's a brand new Israeli settlement there. There's all these spotless buildings. And when you drive past, it's got this wonderful, it's a gated community, of course, has to be to protect it. You drive past the gate and it's got Shiloh. The Jews are building settlements as hard as they can go. They are not going to give up the West Bank. It will become, by Israeli policy and by Bible prophecy being fulfilled, it will become part of Israel proper before Armageddon. And Trump has a man who's his ambassador to Israel who's fully behind that. And he's working for it. Get an idea of how the hand of God works in the affairs of nations? Yes, and it will come to pass. It will be annexed before Armageddon. So what about Jared Kushner, the man who's in the president's ear all the time now? Well, this is a report by Debka. Now, Debka is one of those news organisations that gets behind the news. It reported this in June. Israel and Saudi Arabia have reportedly been holding talks to establish economic ties. Excuse me? Can I read that again? Israel and Saudi Arabia have reportedly been holding talks to establish economic ties. But I thought Saudi Arabia, in the Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, were principal supporters of the nations, the Arab nations, who wanted to destroy Israel. Now that is a big change, isn't it? Just like it is with Egypt. Okay? So things have changed dramatically. And they're changing this year, young people. God is at work in this man who's now the President of the United States of America. The article goes on, a subsequent article went on to say this. The Saudi king's decision to elevate his son, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, 31, so he's quite young to be a crown prince of Saudi Arabia, So Crown Prince and heir to the throne is a game-changing international event. Let me just stop there for a while. The Saudi royal family is so big, and of course when you get a huge family of hundreds of people who are vying for control of one of the richest countries in the Middle East, what they do normally is they make sure that the Crown Prince is from another branch, another arm of the family, just to keep the peace. Okay? Well, this guy, the current king of Saudi Arabia, he had anointed his nephew to become, cousin or nephew, to become the next king of Saudi Arabia. He dumped him. And he made his own son the crown prince, which basically means he runs the country. He's certainly running the defence ministry, because that's what he is, the defence minister. Why is that important? Well, it's important because he's like that with Jared Kushner. They are so close. And this is what they go on to say. This is why they say it's a game-changing international event. With his appointment as de facto ruler of the oil kingdom, the Saudi king's son is ready to step into his allotted place in a new US, Arab, Israeli alliance that will seek to dominate Middle East affairs. That is unbelievable, given the history of the last 50 years. Why is that happening? It's happening to fulfil Bible prophecy. We're going to see a relationship between these Saudi Arabian Gulf states and Yemen eventually, because Saudi Arabia is in Yemen right now. We'll talk about that later on. We're going to see a relationship develop. Could I ask you, are you in Ezekiel 38 right now? Actually, look at verse 13. What does verse 13 say? Sheba and Dedan, this is when Gog comes down upon the land, all right? Not that far away, really. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say, have you come to take a spoil? Etc. Now, who's the first cab off the rank? Who are the first nations to object to Gog's invasion of the Middle East, of Israel in particular? Well, not Britain. Britain's the next one, see? Britain is the Tarshish of that verse. We'll talk about Britain, of course, on Sunday morning, God willing, at the Sunday school session. Okay? We'll get to that. Who's the first cab off the rank to object? Sheba and Dedan. Who's Sheba? Yemen. Saudi Arabia is bringing Yemen under its control, little by little. Who's Dedan? Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Okay? They are the first ones to object to Gog's invasion of the land of Israel. And we are watching the development right now in this year. As a result of Trump's election, we are watching the development of a commercial and political relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, Egypt and Israel. That's why Qatar is on the nose. You've heard about Qatar. I'm not talking about Qatars, okay? Qatar. That's not the stuff that comes out of your nose either. It's, of course, a Gulf state. Qatar is a Gulf. They're the ones who are they're going to host the World Cup of Soccer in the next year or two. All right? And they bought it off, of course. They are now on the nose with the Gulf states. You know why? Because they're starting to build their relationship with Iran, and they're paying heaps of money to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the enemy of Israel. And the Gulf states have said, enough is enough. If you're going to be with Iran and you're going to support Hamas, you can't be part of the Gulf states. Pressure is coming on them to change their mind. And they need to change their mind quickly, because that pressure is going to kill them economically in the end. God is at work, and he's using Donald Trump and Donald Trump's son-in-law as the vehicles to build this new relationship between the power of Saudi Arabia and its allies and Israel. That is one of the most remarkable things that's happened in 2017, young people. And it's shouting at us. It's telling us that our God's at work in the earth, and he's about to send his son. That's what it's saying. And we're living in this year, 2017, and we know God works in 50-year periods. Something dramatic's got to happen. Okay? So let's make sure we don't mess around. Let's make sure that the hope of Israel is beating in our heart, and that we're ready for that day. because it will surely soon come. Just a bit more about this evolving US Sunni Arab bloc. This is a report again by Debker in June. This bloc is in its infancy and has yet to display staying power and prove the wisdom of its policies. But its contours have taken shape. US President Trump is taking the lead role along with Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan of the United Arab Emirates, another crown prince, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Look at the words in green here. The evolving bonds between the US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt and Israel are the source of President Trump's optimism about the prospects of pulling off an Israeli-Palestinian peace accord, a vision which eluded all of his predecessors in the White House, while knocking over the decades-old barriers between the moderate Arab nations and the Jewish state. Remarkable things are taking place. Now, I'm going to wind this talk down by taking you to a few important biblical passages. And the first one is Luke chapter 21. So come along to Luke 21. During the election campaign in America last year, and I happened to be driving around America and I saw a lot of this, there were some rather strange things. Now, the Time magazine had an article in June, okay, and they had this picture, this artist's depiction of Donald Trump, and he's wearing a cap. A lot of Americans wear caps, okay? And the cap read, "Make America 1968 again." Now, why would they put that on there? Well, 1968 was a very, very important year in modern history. I want to point that out to you from Luke chapter 21. Extremely important year in modern history. Well, we know 1967 was the Six-Day War. We know how important that is. Well, 1968 came out of the events of 1967, and Christ said it would in Luke 21. So let's have a look at it. This logo on the cap is interesting. Make America 1968 again. Now, 1968 is celebrated by historians in the world as being the turning point of modern history. That was the year, they say, that history changed. The world changed. And it did. Now, you have up the road a town called Nimbin, true? You know what still happens at Nimbin? Well, you want to go there in 1968. I went to Nimbin in early 1970s, not for any other reason but to see what was happening, okay? But all you need to do is to drive down the main street to see what was happening. Now, Nimbin was in this era. You got a bit of a feel of how the world views that era of time. Way back in 1988, I was in Tasmania, got off a plane, went past a newsstand, and there's the Time magazine. That one, I bought it. I don't normally buy Time magazines, but I bought it. Because on the front cover was the importance of 1968, the year that shaped the generation. In 2008, which is 40 years on from 1968, the BBC had a 3-part series on BBC 4, Radio 4, on the 40th anniversary of 1968. Why would the world do this? Why would they be focusing on 1968? Do they know anything about Bible prophecy? No. But they're focusing on it because Christ said they would. And that's what he meant in Luke 21:25 when we get to it in a minute. Okay? Now, verse 24, first of all. Verse 24 of Luke 21 said, "And they," meaning of course the Jews, "shall fall by the edge of the sword, shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until," there will be a termination, "until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." Now, you might be aware that Jerusalem, in the days of David, until he captured it, for 500 years had been known as Jebus. Jebus in the Hebrew means trodden down. On the 5th of June, the Six-Day War began. On the 7th of June, Israeli soldiers stood inside the old city up against what they called the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. Bible prophecy was fulfilled. there will not be another treading down, a full treading down of Jerusalem, brothers and sisters and young people. Gog, and we'll point this out in our subsequent talks, maybe even suggest it tonight, Gog will not enter into most of the old city. They'll take portion of New Jerusalem, or all of New Jerusalem. They may get a portion of the old, but they will not take it all before Christ arrives on the scene with his saints to destroy them. That's the great drama of Zechariah chapter 14. It's not going to be trodden down fully again. It's had its Jebus days. That's what this prophecy is telling us, as we are going to find from other prophecies. So on the 7th of June, these soldiers stood at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, and they made a vow. All right? And we know that Armageddon, the Temple Mount, will be in Israel's annexation, so it's going to be part of Israel at the time of Armageddon. We saw that from Ezekiel 38 verse 8. Their vow was very clear and emphatic. They said there, as they stood at that wall, "We will never give up the Western Wall until the last drop of blood." So it's going to be another Masada, they're saying. You want to take this old city from us? Then you're going to have to kill every single Jew to do it. We are not going to give it up. And of course, as we're going to see in our considerations here this weekend, they won't have to give it up. Christ and the saints will arrive before the Gogian forces overrun that city. And Bible prophecy speaks eloquently about that, as you're going to see. So what about what follows Luke 21:24? Well, what follows is verse 25. "And there shall be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring." Now we know that sun, moon and stars are used symbolically in the scriptures. The sun is a symbol of political powers that rules the heavens, like governments rule the earth. The moon is a symbol of ecclesiastical system because it derives its light from the sun, as state religions derive their power from governments. And stars, we have no problem with stars, do we? The world's full of film stars and pop stars and you name it. The world's full of stars. We have no problem with that language at all. So what Christ is saying is that 1967, which would be a milestone event in modern history, would be followed immediately by significant political, ecclesiastical and events surrounding so-called stars, most of them political stars. And did 1968 bring that? Well, the world thinks so. The world knows so. This is why they go back and look at 1968. And it was with perplexity. No way forward. They can't see a way forward. I want to show you a quote about that in a minute. The powers of heaven would be shaken. So we've got the powers of heaven, or the governments of the world. That's the symbology that's being used. And men's hearts would begin to fail them for fear and for looking after those things that are coming on the earth. Of course, we read about the sea and the waves roaring. We know that the sea is a symbol in the Word of God for nations. And we've seen, of course, the nations with all of the protests of 1968 right down to our day, some of them leading to death in the streets. By the way, 1968, the Democratic Convention to elect their candidate for the presidency ended up in death in the streets of Chicago. It was a horrendous year. This is what Time magazine said about it in 1988, 20 years after the event. Like a knife blade, the year severed past from the future. The spasms of unrest seemed almost psychologically coordinated, they wrote, as if a mysterious common impulse had swept through the nervous system of a global generation. 1968 had the vibrations of earthquake about it. America shuddered. History cracked open. The year was pivotal and messy. It produced vivid theatre. It reverberates still in the American mind. 1968 was tragedy and horrific entertainment. Deaths of heroes, uprisings, suppressions, the end of dreams, blood in the streets of Chicago and Paris and Saigon, and at Christmas time, almost ludicrously, man floating around the moon. That was 1968. Of course, for most of you young people, that's ancient history. But it is an extremely important history because Christ said it was going to happen. And it did happen. The times of the Gentiles are up, young people. We're now in the time of preparation for Armageddon. And we're going to very shortly see major events. They went on like this. After 20 years, the apocalyptic events of 1968 are still reverberating. And under the theme End of Heroes, which is about stars falling from heaven, the year had many legacies. But the assassinations were among the most important and were the hardest to bear. They altered history and broke something essential in the national morale. They broke hope. This is what Tom Hayden, who was a leader of the anti-Vietnam campaign. The best leaders of our time, he said, were dead. They had been murdered. That is the heart of the tragedy. By 1968, I knew I was part of an apocalypse, which is different from the early idealism. You feel you are carried by events that are out of your control. It's exactly what Christ said would happen. With perplexity. No way of control. No way ahead. No way of solving their problems. That's what they said. So 1968 saw the assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, a candidate for the presidency, tanks in Prague, students rioting in Mexico, riots in Paris. This is what Paris looked like. You wouldn't go to Paris in 1968. Look at that. What a shambles. The modern world had seen nothing like that. It's like the Second World War was back again. And Christ went on to speak about the fig tree. He spoke to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. Now get this. Not just the fig tree. It's not just the emergence of Israel. Notice the emergence of many nations. You see, we know that the fig tree is a symbol of Israel in the scriptures. And the tree is a symbol for nations in Ezekiel 31 and other places. When Israel became a nation in 1948, there were 57 nations in the United Nations. There are now 192. In 70 years. 192 from 57. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. And they're popping up everywhere. That was going to happen in this era that brought about the end of the times of the Gentiles. When they shoot forth, they, not just Israel, they, when they shoot forth, you see and know of your own selves that summer, the time of harvest, is near at hand. So likewise ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is near at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. I don't know how much I've heard about that. Some people think a generation is 40 years. Some think it's 70. Brothers and sisters, a generation is a lifetime. And my father, who's still alive, 92 this year, saw the establishment of the state of Israel. And I believe that prophecy will be fulfilled. But people like him will not fall asleep until Christ comes to make his purpose with you and me a reality. Well, this is the future of the place where we truly belong. Jeremiah 3 verse 17. And the events of Armageddon have changed everything, young people. At that time they shall call Jerusalem the throne of Yahweh. And all nations shall be gathered into it, to the name of Yahweh, to Jerusalem. Neither shall they walk any more after the imagination of their evil heart. Won't that be a great day? So when the Jews are converted, all nations will follow. And that's going to be the work that you and I will be involved in. And this place, which is called Jerusalem, which Hitchcock says means the vision of peace, will become what it's called in Psalm 76, verse 2, where we read, in Judah is God known. His name is great in Israel. In Salem. Where's the Jeru gone? Where's the vision gone? Well, because it's now become a reality. It's no longer a vision. This is the time when Jerusalem will be the centre, the heart of the earth. Yahweh's dwelling place. And you and I have the great hope of being there in that day. So let's conclude with the words of Jeremiah 17. Let's just pop back very quickly to Jeremiah 17. What a marvellous chapter this is. How many exhortations did you just pick up in the reading of 14 verses? Have a look at verse 5 of Jeremiah 17. Thus saith Yahweh, cursed be the man that trusteth in man. That's exactly where Israel is today, as we'll point out in our subsequent talks. they trust in man. Cursed be the man that maketh flesh his arm, whose heart departeth from Yahweh. Come down to verse 7. Blessed is the man that trusteth in Yahweh, and whose hope Yahweh is. Yeah, that's where we are, isn't it? But what's our problem? What's standing between us and life forevermore, young people? What is it that's the real problem? Well, I'll tell you. It's in this chapter. Look at verse 9. This is the problem. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. In the Hebrew it means sick. I know that. I know that from bitter personal experience. The heart is deceitful. And this world is appealing to it today in a way that it never has in the past. The people of the past never had to contend with gadgets that you had to have an operation to get out of your hand. Alright? They never had to contend with internets, where you can access anything you like. And if you like it, you're in trouble. Okay? They've never had to have the trials and the tests that have been applied to the last generation of Christadelphian young people. We are the most tested generation in human history, and we have a problem. And the problem is that our heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. But there's someone who knows it. See what it says in verse 10? I, Yahweh, search the heart. I try the reins, even to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. He wants outcomes in our life. He wants some fruit. And there's only one way to get it. You have got to have a hope burning in your heart that will overcome every obstacle, that will lift you above every corrupt thing in the earth. And I know what it is. And John Thomas discovered it in 1847. Alright? It's the hope of Israel. So when you come down to verse 12, Jeremiah 17, you read this. A glorious high throne from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary. That's what it's going to become. O Yahweh, the hope of Israel. All that forsake thee shall be ashamed, and they that depart from me shall be written in the earth. They won't be in the book of life, they'll be written in the earth, just like Jesus wrote the names of all of those Pharisees in John chapter 8, remember? He was writing their names in the earth. This is where it's coming from. He's writing their names in the earth, not in the book of life. And goes on to say in verse 14, here's our answer. An appeal every day of our lives, young people. Never let a day conclude. Never go to bed. Never lay your head on a pillow, young people, unless you pray to your God to help you the next day. Because I'll tell you something. The day that's just passed, in many cases, will not have been a great success. Because the heart is deceitful above all things. Okay, so let's get our act together. Let's make sure we appeal to our God. The words of verse 14. Heal me, O Yahweh. He's the only one who can. Heal me, O Yahweh, and I shall be healed. Save me, and I shall be saved. For thou art my praise. That's what the one whom we come here tonight to consider, whose eyes are upon this land every day of every year, wants to see in us. He wants to see a realisation that there is in our heart a hope, the hope of Israel. In our subsequent studies, we're going to have a look at Israel's latter-day self-confidence and arrogance. We're going to see why they need to be humbled and why we have a great work in front of us, young people, if we are found to be faithful to the end.